Good afternoon, everyone. The Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs will come to order. Without objection, the chairman is authorized to declare recess of the subcommittee at any time. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony for an oversight hearing entitled Federal Indian Trust Asset Management, Progress Made but Improvement Needed. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3.0. Without objection, so ordered. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, the subcommittee meets for an oversight hearing titled Federal Indian Trust Asset Management, Progress Made but Improvement Needed. Today's hearing will continue the work of the subcommittee to elevate tribal autonomy while reiterating the trust responsibility of the federal government towards American Indians and Alaska Natives. The federal trust responsibility is the legal obligation of the United States towards tribes. This trust responsibility includes the stewardship of tribal lands and assets, but that responsibility has not always been properly managed. In the early 1990s, the Department of the Interior's mismanagement of tribal trust assets was exposed. Trust asset ownership was not up to date, natural resource assets were in disarray, and the weaknesses in the systems, policies, and procedures were highlighted. The United States had not lived up to its trust responsibility. Recognizing that failure, Congress passed the American Indian Trust Fund Management Reform Act of 1994 in hopes of reforming this broken system. However, this was not an all-encompassing fix, and shortly after, a major lawsuit was filed against the United States. In Cobin versus Salazar, the Department of the Interior was accused of mismanaging individual Indian money accounts held for the benefit of tribal members with trust assets. The Cobin versus Salazar case was settled by the Obama administration, but the issue at its core was whether the federal government was the best manager of tribal assets. With this line of thinking, Congress enacted the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act, or ITARA, in 2016, which reaffirmed the federal trust responsibility while promoting tribal self-determination with trust assets. ITARA created a 10-year demonstration program that allowed tribes to manage their own trust assets. That demonstration program is what we will focus on today. The original intent of the demonstration project was to allow tribes to take control over a wide range of trust assets. Yet, after 9 years, only 2 tribes have been able to enter into this program. This is unacceptable. We will hear from multiple tribal witnesses today on why this program has not lived up to its full potential. I understand that some core issues are limited by which the Department of the Interior has placed the program, as well as bureaucratic red tape, a lack of awareness of the program, and a lengthy and confusing process. With the demonstration program set to expire in 2026, now is the time to identify where the barriers are and how we can overcome them. The subcommittee has seen time and time again how much better suited tribes are to manage their own programs and assets. This is one of those cases. I want to thank all of our tribal witnesses for traveling here today to speak in person on this important issue, and I look forward to a robust discussion. The chairman now recognizes the ranking minority member for any statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to each of our witnesses, and thank you for traveling all the way to Washington, D.C. to share with us your experiences, your expectations, and your frustrations. The Indian Trust Asset Reform Act that we're going to talk about today really goes at the core of what we should be doing in the federal government, which is giving back to the tribes what they always deserved and had before the federal government kind of stepped in and messed it up, right? Like, you knew how to manage your lands. You managed them for centuries. And tribal management of forest land has been recognized over and over as some of the best. I happen to represent the Hickory Apache Nation for several decades. You all nodding your head because you know they have a great forest management program. We actually defended them in court when the state wanted to come in and say, you're not allowed to do that. And the judge said, wait a minute, we should learn some lessons from what they are doing. The Mescalero Apache tribe in New Mexico, renowned forest work. And so what this program was supposed to do was to give that authority back to you. But there have been many frustrations. But the concept of making sure that you have that authority, I think, is what we see reflected in the report that says we should make it permanent, but let's fix some of the problems, and that's what you're going to share with us today. Because it should not take 4 years to get a plan approved and implemented, which is one of the things that we have heard and we will hear today. But imagine how long it will take if the people who are necessary to approve that no longer sit on a desk. And sadly, we will have to talk about that today because over 2,000 Department of Interior staff have been fired, terminated, or maybe they've just retired and there's no intent to replace them. At one college in my beautiful state, 20% of their employees were laid off. Said go home. Some of them who had been teaching for years, they were taken out of their classroom, and now those students don't know if they don't have a professor to teach the course that is required for them to get their degree, how will they graduate? So this is also an issue that we will need to address, is how do we actually provide the resources so that the department that needs to give you the authority can indeed do so. I'm disappointed that no one from the Trump administration or the BIA is testifying before us so that we can raise concerns directly. This is a Republican administration. This is a Republican-led committee, and I'm very grateful to our subcommittee chair for the work he does and the concern he brings to this. But these are the kinds of concerns that we cannot ignore. But the principle that we are going to talk about today and that you are carrying out, I am completely committed to. And so I am grateful that we are having this oversight hearing before the act expires, so we can determine what do we need to do to improve it and then to actually fund it so that those 55 million acres of tribal land in the United States and 19 million of which are forested in 33 different states can be managed by the tribes under the principle of self-government and under the principle that the trust responsibility should be transformed to say that we trust you because you know your land, your history, your people, and your cultures better than anybody in Washington, D.C. But we need to make sure that the funding flows together with that trust. And so addressing that underfunding and that staffing, I think, is a really important part of this puzzle that we will work on together. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Ledger-Fernandez. The chair will now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from California, for an opening statement. Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I am glad that you and the ranking member are having this hearing. It's important to take a look at this law, at TARA, which strengthens tribal self-governance by empowering tribes to exercise greater control and management of their land and resources. And so this demonstration project that we'll be hearing about today under Title II of that law was intended to allow tribes to voluntarily submit trust asset management plans to assume control over forest management and/or surface leasing activities on their trust lands. And then once approved, these plans permit tribes to implement management approaches that align with their environmental, economic, and cultural priorities. And with that law having been enacted in 2016 and getting set to run its course, it is a very good time, after nearly a decade of implementation, to take a look at assessing the demonstration project's impact, and our witnesses here today will provide us invaluable insights into that, into the successes and the challenges of the demonstration project, so that we can evaluate its effectiveness and some future direction. Recent testimony before the subcommittee emphasized the importance of the demonstration project, and also the 2023 Indian Forest Management Assessment Team, which gave a report that underscored Atara's significance while highlighting the ongoing challenges in tribal forestry and resource management. One finding from the report that stands out and is particularly relevant to today's discussion is that many tribes still don't know about Atara. So the report recommends extending the Atara demonstration project indefinitely, a recommendation that I look forward to hearing more about from our witnesses. And although the law initially set the demonstration project's duration at 10 years, it includes a provision that allows for an extension at the Secretary's discretion. I am disappointed that the majority chose not to include the BIA in this hearing, because it would have been good to hear from them about all of this. I believe it's critical that the agency be present in this discussion, and by not inviting them, we limit our ability to address the challenges faced at the administrative level and hinder the opportunities for an open dialogue between the subcommittee, the BIA, and the witnesses and stakeholders. I would also be remiss not to mention the recent termination of thousands of federal workers across various agencies, including the BIA. The BIA already struggles with limited funding and personnel to effectively carry out its responsibilities, and these workforce reductions raise serious concerns about the long-term viability of programs like Atara. These terminations will have lasting consequences, further limiting the agency's ability to support tribal nations and implement critical programs. Reports indicate that up to 118 BIA employees were expected to be terminated, although the exact number remains unclear. If key positions remain unfilled and essential services are unstaffed or understaffed, the BIA will continue to underperform, ultimately hurting Indian country. So as we move forward, I do hope this subcommittee will remain committed to advocating for the BIA and tribes to have the staffing, resources, and the funding necessary to support tribal nations and their citizens. Thanks again, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Huffman. It's now my pleasure to introduce the witnesses for our panel. The first is Mr. Glen Gobin, the Tulalip Tribal Council of the Tulalip Tribes in Tulalip, Washington. Welcome. Next is Mr. Cody Desautel, President of the Intertribal Timber Council in Portland, Oregon. Welcome, Mr. Desautel. And now I would like to recognize Ms. Randall from Washington for 1 minute to introduce the witness from her district. Ms. Randall.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Gobin from Tulalip for joining us as well as President Capoeman. We so appreciate you taking the time and effort to journey across the country. I know firsthand how hard it can be making this trip back and forth every weekend. I've really enjoyed working alongside President Capoeman as a member of the state legislature and look forward to a continued relationship. President Guy Capoeman is the president of the Quinault Business Committee, the elected legislative body of the Quinault Indian Nation, a nation located on 208,000 acres in the southwestern corner of the Olympic Peninsula, cradled between the snow-capped Olympic Mountains and the northern Pacific Ocean. It is a beautiful place with Roosevelt elk, black bear, black-tailed deer, bald eagles, cougar, and many other animals. And Mr. Capoeman has served on the council for 15 years in many positions, and is also, fun fact, incredible artist and carver of a 34-foot ocean-going cedar canoe not too long ago in his studio, and a 15-foot carved cedar statue, our fisherman, our guardian, that the town of Gig Harbor is very lucky to host at historic village side of the Squoop Band of the Tulalip tribe. And I'm grateful for his leadership and so glad to have him here today.
Thank you, Ms. Randall. And finally, last but not least, Ms. Amber Scholes-Oliver, Executive Director of the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, also in Portland, Oregon. Welcome. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the talk button on the microphone. We do use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have 1 minute left, the light will turn yellow. And at the end of the 5 minutes, the light will turn red. And I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will also allow all witnesses on the panel to testify before member questioning. The chairman now recognizes Chair Gobin for 5 minutes. Chair Gobin.
Good afternoon, Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Ledger Fernandez, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Glen Gobin. My traditional name is Ticha, and I serve on the Tulalip Tribal Council. On behalf of the Tulalip Tribes, we thank you for the opportunity to testify today on Indian Trust asset management. My testimony will focus on Tulalip's experience in trying to utilize the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act, ITARA. ITARA was signed into law in 2016. The act streamlines the process of Indian Trust resource management, strengthening tribal sovereignty and furthering tribal self-determination. Title II of the act allows the Secretary of Interior to enter into an Indian Trust asset management plan and requires the tribe to identify the Indian Trust asset that will be subject to the plan. Once approved, the plan allows the tribe to direct how they want their trust assets managed. In March of 2019, Tulalip Tribe sent a tribal resolution and letter to the department requesting to participate in this demonstration project. Tulalip identified its reservation tidelands. Tulalip Tribes has jurisdiction to manage and regulate the reservation tidelands and its use under the Treaty of Point Elliott by executive order and tribal constitution. The treaty and executive order established and set aside and reserved for the benefit of the Tulalip people the Tulalip Indian Reservation, which included the tidelands to the extreme low tide, as the permanent homeland for a seafaring and fishing tribe. The shoreline is where many ancestral settlements and burial sites are located and where tribal fishing, gathering, and cultural activities, as well as recreation, continue today. The protection and management of the reservation tidelands by the tribe is both necessary and indispensable to protect and preserve and use of the homeland for our treaty fishing rights. Fishing shellfish resources are a vital component to the economy, culture, subsistence, and identity to the Tulalip people. The right to harvest these resources is secured for the exclusive use of the tribe under the Treaty of Point Elliott, as confirmed in U.S. v. Washington. The tidelands provide essential habitat and food for these tribal resources, and protection of these tidelands is essential to preserve, benefiting future generations of the tribal people. Today, the shoreline is studded with marinas, parking lots, public buildings, houses, cabins, docks, bulkheads, and beach access stairways, causing increased beach erosion, loss of beach sediment, and loss of beach vegetation, causing negative impacts to fish and shellfish resources. We have had several meetings with the department discussing the tidelands and their requests. We provided information regarding the location of the tidelands, ongoing asset and resource management on the tidelands, and surface lease information of the tidelands. Ultimately, we were told in unambiguous terms that ITARA demonstration project was limited to forestry resource and surface leases. The law, however, does not limit what trust assets are subject to the plan, and there is no language in the bill that would support limited or narrow reading of the scope of trust resources. Tulalip renewed its efforts to enter into an ITAMP in 2023, this time with the new administration. The department told us to send a draft plan and that they would review it and determine whether the tidelands would qualify as an Indian trust asset pursuant to the law. Separately, we have heard from others that the department is continuing to make the same determination as prior administration in limiting the plan to forestry resources. While the tribe will continue to manage its tidelands in cooperation with the department, it would prefer to include the tidelands in a trust management plan to better achieve the tribe's management objectives. The department's narrow and unfounded interpretation of ITARA, however, is frustrating this effort. To avoid further confusion and misinterpretation of the law, we recommend Congress amend ITARA to remove these roadblocks and make demonstration projects permanent. We thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on this critical matter for Indian country.
Thank you very much, Chair Gobin, for that testimony. The chairman now recognizes President Desautel for 5 minutes. Mr. Desautel.
Thank you, Chairman Hurd and members of the committee. My name is Cody Desautel, and I serve as the president of the Intertribal Timber Council. I'll focus my comments on timber assets and the forest planning provisions of the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act. 10 years ago, the ITC supported the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act, particularly the demonstration project of Title II. The intent was to allow tribes greater control in the management of their natural resources. Public Law 114-178 authorized the ITARA demonstration project for 10 years from its enactment in June of 2016. Given the extensive time it took to approve the first project, the ITC strongly supports an extension of the ITARA authority prior to its June 2026 expiration date. The statute states that the demonstration projects may be extended at the discretion of the Secretary. We've continually requested the Secretary to use his or her authority to do this, but unfortunately have been unsuccessful. Of course, permanent extension is also possible by an act of Congress, which we hope this committee will consider. The ITC member tribes Coquille and Cow Creek have successfully implemented ITARA and have approved Indian Trust Asset Management Plans, or ITAMPs, for their forest resources. Both tribes have demonstrated ITARA's effectiveness in promoting tribal self-determination, environmental stewardship, and economic sustainability. ITARA has enabled the tribes to manage its forest resources under its own laws and regulations, significantly reducing bureaucratic delays while streamlining review and approval processes. As a result, the tribe has been able to dramatically reduce approval timelines for forest management projects, advance forestry goals and objectives with greater autonomy, swiftly access growing markets for forest products while optimizing revenue generation, and increasing revenue streams which are reinvested into vital services for tribal members. Over the course of the demonstration projects, the tribes have successfully conducted numerous forest management and fuels projects. Moving on to IFMAT. The committee is aware that the National Indian Forest Resource Management Act mandates that an independent scientific review of Indian Trust forests once every decade. The latest report from the Indian Forest Management Assessment Team, or IFMAT, was presented to Congress in 2023 and contains hundreds of recommendations for improving Indian forest management. The ITC reiterates its request for an oversight hearing before this committee to ensure that its recommendations are being considered and implemented. The 2023 IFMAT report contains specific observations about ITARA, noting that approximately 80% of tribal trust forest acres are managed wholly or partially under Public Law 93-638 contracts, cooperative agreements, or compacts. As tribes continue to move towards self-governance with examples like ITARA, IFMAT found the context of the inherent federal function and the relationship in fulfilling the Secretary's trust responsibility changes. This leaves a residual trust responsibility that is not well understood and can lead to underutilization of self-governance authorities. IFMAT found that there are specific benefits for tribes and the BIA in carrying out forest management activities under ITARA and self-governance more generally. Tribes are carrying out forest management activities under ITARA are performing functions previously considered inherent federal functions, yet funds are not made available to the tribes for these additional responsibilities. The ITC supports the ITARA recommendations within the IFMAT report, including permanent extension of the ITARA authority, direct funds to tribes held by Interior when they are performing inherent federal functions under ITARA, improving funding, policy, and procedure guidance provided by the BIA regional offices concerning ITARA implementation needs, establishing a training program that provides BIA officials and tribal leaders with better strategies for engagement consistent with congressional policy. This is something ITC is prepared to support the BIA with. Identifying funding sources for the tribes to participate in the ITARA demonstration projects, and review of the context of the Secretary's responsibility in fulfilling the performance of inherent federal functions, including related funding issues. In conclusion, in addition to the recommendations above, I want to reinforce the importance of maintaining an adequate funding and staffing for BIA to assist tribes with the development, review, approval, and funding of Indian Trust asset management plans. When the Coquille ITAMP was approved in 2020, the BI had almost 8,000 employees. Our understanding is that the current workforce is approximately half that, and the number is dropping. Without adequate qualified staff in BIA, we are likely to see continued delays in the implementation and use of this authority. Thank you again for holding today's Oversight Committee hearing, and stand ready to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, President Desautel, for that testimony. The chairman now recognizes President Capoeman for 5 minutes. President Capoeman.
Good afternoon, Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Ledger-Fernandez, Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Huffman, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify before you today on the Quinault Nation's experiences with the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act, ITARA. My name is Guy Capoeman, and I am the duly elected president of the Quinault Indian Nation Business Committee. I've held this position for the last 4 years and currently serving in my second term. As you know, ITARA was enacted into law in June 2016. This legislation was intended to enhance tribal self-determination by granting tribes greater authority over the management of our trust assets. Under ITARA, tribes are authorized to conduct forestry programs under tribal law and regulations to assume functions previously considered as inherent federal functions of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. A key component of ITARA was the establishment of a voluntary demonstration project that allows participating tribes to develop and implement their own Indian Trust asset management plans. These plans enable tribes to set objectives and priorities for assets located within their reservations or under their jurisdiction. To manage these activities such as surface leasing, forest land management, without requiring further approval from the Secretary of the Interior. However, while ITARA was intended to support tribes, its implementation has been fraught with challenges. Lack of clarity and significant delays in execution have undermined its goals. For example, the BIA struggled to define parameters of ITARA. It was not until October 1st, 2018, over 2 years after ITARA's passage, that the BIA provided initial guidance to tribes. Even with this guidance, tribes continued to face uncertainty. And Quinault, for example, spent almost 3 years seeking answers to ITARA implementation. These issues are not unique to Quinault, but are instead endemic to ITARA. In 2023, as required by the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act, the U.S. Forest Service Division of Forestry and Intertribal Timber Council, in support of the Secretary of the Interior, completed its 10-year Indian Forest Management Assessment Team, IFMAT report. The IFMAT report primarily serves to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of Indian forest lands and associated management practices, while also assessing the status, management, health, and utilization of these forests. The IFMAT report addressed: ITARA promises self-governance benefits for interested tribes. However, many tribes have little or no knowledge about ITARA. Tribes carrying out forest management activities under ITARA are performing functions previously considered inherent federal functions performed by the BIA, yet funds are not made available to these tribes for these additional responsibilities. Quinault and other tribes believe that ITARA has the potential to benefit Indian nations across the country. However, the very challenges ITARA was designed to address, excessive regulation, lack of clarity, and inadequate federal responsiveness, continue to impede its success and undermine its goal of promoting self-determination. Again, more red tape that tribes have to face to get something done. To address these issues and support the implementation of ITARA, Quinault respectfully requests that the subcommittee take the following actions. As recommended in the IFMAT report, the ITARA demonstration project set to expire in June 26 should be extended indefinitely to allow tribes to continue working toward the self-governance and forest management outcomes envisioned by the Act. Continue to support ITARA and similar legislation that advances tribal self-governance while minimizing overreaching regulatory requirements. As more tribes assume forestry program management responsibilities under ITARA, the BIA's role should be re-evaluated. ITARA is intended to empower tribes, require the DOI, the BIA, and other relevant agencies to implement ITARA as originally intended, streamlining processes and providing clear guidance when needed. And I'll say this, that the great Joe Delacruz said, "There's no more right, more sacred than the inherent right to govern yourself." And that means your lands and resources as well. I want to thank the committee for this opportunity to testify here today. Siokwu.
Thank you, President Capoeman, for that testimony. The chairman now recognizes Ms. Scholes-Oliver for 5 minutes. Ms. Scholes-Oliver.
Nik Pashwai. Good afternoon. My name is Amber Schultz-Oliver. I am Yakima and Wasco, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, or ATNI. The ATNI Executive Board has asked me to be here today to provide this testimony on the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act. I want to thank Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Ledger Fernandez, and members of the subcommittee for allowing me to appear today. ATNI was founded in 1953 and represents 57 tribal governments from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Southeast Alaska, Northern California, and Montana. In 2011, ATNI's Trust Reform Committee began developing the underlying bill text that Congress would 5 years later enact into law as ITARA. This effort involved ATNI leadership, our member tribes, and technical staff. We were proud to see a bill that originated from our organization be signed into law as one of the only Indian policy bills of the 114th Congress. ITARA contains 3 titles. Title I includes findings and a reaffirmation that the responsibility of the United States to Indian tribes includes a duty to promote self-determination regarding governmental authority and economic development. Title II establishes a 10-year demonstration project that authorizes Indian tribes on a voluntary basis to direct the management of their trust resources through negotiated agreements with the Secretary of the Interior. This title is based on Indian country's recognition that in nearly every instance, Indian tribes have demonstrated that they are better managers of their natural resources and affairs than the federal government. Finally, Title III of ITARA authorizes the creation of an Undersecretary for Indian Affairs and directs the Secretary to prepare a report to the authorizing committees on a transition of functions from the Office of the Special Trustee. Although no administration has established the Undersecretary position since ITARA was enacted, ATNI continues to support the establishment of that position. ATNI's initial enthusiasm of ITARA's enactment into law in 2016 was tempered when the department began tribal consultation on its implementation. When the department consulted on Title II, it presented a template document that contained broad waivers of liability and other requirements not required or even contemplated by the text of the ITARA law. Another major concern is the department's continued assertion that only forest resources and surface leases can be included in trust asset management agreements. As drafted, ITARA applies broadly to trust resources. AT&I intentionally did not define the term trust resources out of concern that the administration might reject traditional energy resources from its scope, like coal or oil and gas. There is no basis, legal or otherwise, for the department's continued view that the law is limited to forestry and surface leases. AT&I recommends that the committee consider clarifying amendments to ITARA that will eliminate the agency-imposed obstacles to tribal participation. At a minimum, AT&I recommends 3 changes. The first is to eliminate the Secretary's discretion in Section 203A of the law to dissuade or reject tribes from submitting trust asset management agreements. The language should be revised to eliminate the initial application requirement. Tribes should be able to submit proposed agreements for the Secretary's consideration without that initial step. Second, the committee should address the department's unfounded interpretation that only forest resources and surface leases are includable in trust asset agreements. The department's misguided interpretation of the law has prevented Indian country from utilizing ITARA to its full potential. AT&I will work with the committee on language to ensure that Indian tribes can include the full breadth of tribal trust resources in trust asset agreements as we originally intended. Finally, any amendments should make the demonstration project in Title II permanent. In 2024, AT&I adopted Resolution 2425, which urged the Secretary to make the demonstration project permanent, and the National Congress of American Indians adopted this resolution at its 2024 annual convention. Despite these calls for the Secretary to administratively extend the program, no action has been taken to date. AT&I is grateful for the subcommittee holding today's hearing. We look forward to working with the committee on issues related to ITARA. This concludes my testimony, and I will be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Scholes-Oliver, for that testimony. The chairman will now recognize members for 5 minutes of questions each, and I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Scholes-Oliver, can you talk to me a little bit about, your testimony is really interesting. My sense is that the problem is not necessarily in the language of ITARA, but the way that it's being implemented by the BIA. Is that a fair characterization?
That is correct. The issue is that there's a narrow view of the definition of the trust assets.
Do you know why that would be? Or is there a reason given, I should say?
Not to my knowledge. It certainly wasn't intended in the original language of the text of the bill. And we understand that trust assets can be widely diverse. And AT&I is committed to working with the committee to developing and further refining that definition.
So part of that suggested fix might be making it clear what the definition of those assets is then, that it's broad, that it's not necessarily narrow as the BIA seems to have interpreted it.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Capoeman, you mentioned that ITARA was intended to empower tribes. I think that's right, that's a great point, but it seems to not be doing that with 2 exceptions here. One of the things that you mentioned was that there's little knowledge of ITARA, and that many tribes are unaware of those opportunities that comes with ITARA. And then, of course, as we're hearing today, those who are aware of it and do apply face lots of confusing and unnecessary restrictions. What should Congress and the Department of the Interior do to improve outreach with respect to ITARA? Is there a role that could be done there to let tribes know that this is an option? If you could hit your mic real quick.
Every region within the timber area should be notified where there's caucuses of tribes that come together to be informed of what exactly ITARA is, what its intent is, how all these tribes see it moving forward. I think that's the best way to get the word out and to get some feedback from tribes on how it should work.
Mr. Capoeman, if you could change, 2 or 3 things about Atara, just if you could insert the language in the statute or direct the BIA to do 2 or 3 things, can you name 2 or 3 things just off the top of your head that would be most useful, most productive?
Well, I think the first thing is follow through. I know we have ITARA, and the follow through on the side of the BIA to ensure that it's getting done and passed down to tribes would be the first thing. The second thing is to work with tribes on creating the best format so that tribes can succeed with this. The third thing is ensuring that the dollars to manage and do this work that was formerly done by the BIA be given to tribes as well, because that's a part of it, right? Those are the big 3 that I think need to occur.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Gobin, you mentioned the narrow and cramped interpretation of ITARA, and you talked about the importance of removing roadblocks. Could you give me a couple examples of what are concrete roadblocks that, in your experience, you've seen thrown up with respect to this process?
Our reservation, our reservation consists of 22,000 acres. Of that, much of it is checkerboarded through various policies, procedures through history, and has went out of trust into non-Indian ownership, non-member ownership. So we have, it's like a 3-sided reservation. One side is completely bordering the water. So as such, you go along, you have tribal property, and then you have upland non-Indian property. Throughout all of that process, though, never has the tribe sold its tidelands, never has it relinquished right to the tidelands. And so it creates a dispute at time. Oftentimes growing up as a kid, more so back then, we were told we were trespassing on our own reservation and had to deal with that when we fished commercially, often beach seine, so it's from the shore. So then you're limited by where you can actually fish anymore because now bulkheads have been placed in place there, and you lose your access to that shoreline at various stages of the tide. Those are the major things that you see. Through time, the design of bulkheads and that has changed, and there's far more hard armoring on the shoreline than ever before. And we want to work with people to redesign, reshape what that shoreline looks like while still protecting the habitat and the environments there and still enjoying the use of the beach.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gobin. I appreciate that. Thank you, witnesses, for your testimony. My time has expired, and I yield back. I will now recognize Ranking Member Teresa Ledger-Fernandez for 5 minutes. Ranking Member Ledger-Fernandez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it strikes me that 10 years is both a long time and not a long time, right? And that sort of this law was passed in 2016, apparently probably signed into law by Obama. And then in about 2017, it took, the regulations looks like were passed. And then the process began for applying. And right now, we went through another 4 years of the Biden administration. Now we're back on the Trump administration, and we only have 4 tribes participating. And I need to give it up to Oregon, because 3 of them are in Oregon and 1 of them is in Washington. And so clearly there has been a failure of communication so that this is not more widespread. And I'm wondering if any of you, maybe I'll go to you, Ms. Oliver, to give a sense, because you were there when the idea of this sparked excitement. What can we do so that more tribes can learn of the opportunity? I think I checked, and it looks like we might have less than 10 actually applying, and we've heard why not, but what is it that we need to do to expand its breath outside of the beautiful Pacific Northwest?
Thank you for that question. And to clarify, I should have mentioned I've only been in this position for 2 years, so I wasn't there at the beginning, but that doesn't mean that I'm not
Aware.
excited about about this bill. So I think one of the things that we can do has been mentioned by my counterparts and tribal leaders here. One is to eliminate the initial application requirement under 203A. There's an inherent sort of way to sort of not self-select, but kind of handpick tribes that are able to participate in the program. That may be an unintended consequence, but I think elimination of that requirement might open up the opportunities for other tribes to participate.
So it also strikes me that one of them is an issue, and we went across this with law enforcement, with 638 contracts compacting, that sometimes it's really the tribes who have more capacity, they're able to do that. And so it's like if you have more resources and capacity, you're able to take advantage where other tribes aren't. And it just strikes me, I was looking at some of the numbers that for tribal forest lands receive only 40 cents for every dollar allocated to the National Forest Service lands. Tribes and BIA manage twice as many acres per forestry staff member compared. So you guys are doing a whole lot with less. And we had both Mr. Desautel, President Capoeman, and President Desautel talk about the fact that you needed more resources, right? Because it becomes, if we don't fund the programs, then when you take it over, even if you were then able to contract those down, you're not bringing enough money down. Are you concerned about that, that if we don't fund these programs when you go to take them over, or if we say as part of the project, we need to make sure that you can push those resources down? What is that sort of like tension that you have with regards to that? I'll start with President Desautel.
Well, I think that's a very important consideration, and I think a lack of information in the difference between what an Indian Trust Asset Management Plan is and what those flexibilities are versus what a traditional 638 contract mechanism is are important for tribes to understand. And again, the funding is equally important because, I mean, it makes no sense to develop a plan if you don't have funding to then implement that plan, because the tribe's long-term objectives are to do that on-the-ground resource management, to improve conditions and resources for access to their tribal membership. So without a ready funding source, and I think tribes are unsure about what that funding mechanism would be. They're familiar with the 638 because we've used it for the last 3 decades, but for ITARA, that's a little unclear.
Right, and so we need to put that in the language. And looking at the public law, you're right, it does not limit. But President Capoeman, if you can answer the question, and then I'll yield back.
Yeah, I think what my colleague here has said really hits it on the head. I mean, if the BIA is not there to do that trust responsibility, the tribe's going to take that on and ensure that that work gets done and manage those lands, those resources, and do all those things. Then in effect, the tribe itself takes on that trust responsibility to do that work for the landowners. So then in order to do that work, we need those funds to pull that off. And whether that's 638 contracting or another format, they go hand in hand. And I think that's going to be the big kicker in how this moves forward. And nowadays, for us to find a forester out there, I mean, we're undermanned as it is to do the work we have to do, and underfunded to do the work we have to do as well. So, yeah, they both go hand in hand.
Okay, thank you very much, and I appreciate your answers, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Ledger Fernandez. The chair now recognizes Mr. Kennedy from Utah for 5 minutes. Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an honor to be here with you and the committee, and thanks for those witnesses that took all the time to come to Washington, D.C. We're grateful to have you here, and I particularly appreciate that you've pointed out a problem and you've also offered solutions. Each one of you in your written testimony have offered us opportunities for us to step in and try to help. So thank you for that. Many times we have people pointing out problems, but they're unwilling to give us options for solutions, so thank you. I'm interested, Mr. Gobin, in your testimony. I wanted, just for clarification's sake, Snoqualmie Falls is part of your ancestral heritage or not?
In our usual and accustomed areas.
Yeah, I've been there many times. It's a beautiful area. And in fact, one of the things, and I'm interested overall with all four of you, is why the Bureau of Indian Affairs is not willing to give you the access to the full benefit of what this 10 years ago law was passed, what it was supposed to do. It's almost like the BIA has an intent to not execute on the intent behind our law, that they don't really want you to have full power. And I'm very supportive of states, and in this case, the tribes, of executing their full power. So Mr. Gobin, I'm curious, and this is where I'm interested, because in your written testimony, thank you for doing that, you said, quote, "Today the shoreline is studded with marinas, parking lots, public buildings, houses, cabins, docks, bulkheads, and beach access stairways, causing negative impact on shorelines on the reservation and throughout Puget Sound." I've been to those areas. They're beautiful areas. And what I'm concerned about is that the BIA is more interested in those boats and marinas and docks than they are in the tribal rights to use those properties in the ways that ancestrally you're able to. Can you give me an opinion that you have about why is the BIA not helping you to carry forward the full intent of the law? Does it have anything to do with the private property rights of these boats and marinas and docks?
Yes, certainly I can. And I do have an opinion. I believe that they're misreading the document because it uses examples of forestry or land leases. Like, to them, it must imply that it only belongs to that. But this is an Indian Trust Asset Management. And so, as such, when we go back to the executive order establishing our reservation, which includes all of the tidelands to the low water mark, those are held in trust by the United States government for the benefit of the tribe. You do an instant Google search of what is a trust asset for tribes. Number one is land held in trust for the tribe. Number one. So I'm not sure why they're not including that. It makes no sense to us, but it needs to be changed and reaffirmed. If they can't determine the intent by themselves, I would ask that the committee establish what that is and clearly identify what that is and make it permanent.
Thank you for that answer, and it does reflect the land being held in trust, almost like you can't handle it yourself. We'll handle it for you and give you whatever ancillary benefits we get around to. It seems like an inferior position that you're put in as a result of this somewhat parental relationship that the federal government is putting you in. Would you characterize it that way or in some other way?
I think you did it very well. It's the paternal aspect and looking out for this. Or maybe it's the lack of resources that they have and not willing to expand it further.
Thank you for that. I'm really interested in eliminating that parental relationship. I believe you and your people are more than capable of handling these. We'll go to, for a moment then, Ms. Amber Schultz-Oliver, thank you very much for being here. And you recommended that the demonstration project be made permanent. And I'm in fact interested in that as well. I think that could be good policy. Tell me how you and ADNI came up with that recommendation.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things it would do is it would expand more tribes to be able to take advantage of this act. As we heard testimony, not very many have been able to submit their plans and get their plans approved. Yeah, I think, and it also allows for longer-term management rather than just a short 10-year period.
Thank you for that answer. Mr. Chair, I'll just finish just by saying it seems like there's an intentional misreading of this law, that the Bureau has no interest really in these people being able to manage. And the law, as far as I've been led to believe, it's fairly clear, but the Bureau does not want to allow it to be read in that clarity. So whatever I and we can do to help. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the time to ask these questions, but I'm concerned about 10 years and only 2 tribes being allowed to do anything with this law, which seems to be fairly clear on its face. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. The chair now recognizes Ms. Hoyle from Oregon for 5 minutes. Ms. Hoyle.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony. I have the great honor to represent 4 tribal nations, 2 of which, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Indians and the Quinault, have been, were the first 2 tribes in the country to have approved Indian Trust asset management plans. In the Pacific Northwest, we have been leading the way on forest management, and I'm not going to ask you to assign intent or an explanation to what the BIA is doing. What I am going to ask you, specifically, Mr. Desautel, I'd like you to share some of the positive benefits from these agreements, both for the tribes and then also for the surrounding communities.
Sure, thank you for the question. So from the tribal perspective, under an approved trust asset management plan, they have more discretion on setting priorities, establishing timelines, and really circumventing some of those bureaucratic processes that would exist if those were BIA-approved plans. So that's particularly beneficial for some of the smaller tribes that maybe have smaller acreages to manage, smaller staff and capacity to deal with those types of NEPA documents, which I'm sure this committee knows are very complicated. So I think that provides a lot of flexibility that allows implementation to flow much easier. It also allows them to be more flexible if there's shifting priorities. So for a Cobble example, extensive amount of wildfire on our reservation over the last decade, and we could shift what our priorities were and what forest health treatments would be done first versus next. And then from a cross-jurisdictional co-management type approach, it gives them the ability to work with their neighbors more flexibly. So under state regulations, things move faster. Private industry regulated by the state can move faster. So really, we're just looking at our federal partners at that point. What can we do collectively across the landscape to mitigate risk, to improve forest health and management, to improve those other resource benefits that are critical for everybody in our communities: clean water, clean air, healthy landscapes. So I think those are tools that are very, very valuable when you have more flexibility from a management perspective.
Thank you. And I think we spoke earlier about the potential of having field hearings, certainly with the ONC lands in Oregon, and having examples of tribal nations that have used the Indian Trust Asset Management Plan with the checkerboard pattern, so we can see forests managed by tribes next to forests managed by the Forest Service and the BLM and private lands, and where our wildfires go. I think it's clear that tribes manage for future generations and in a holistic nature. Certainly with millennia of experience relying on tribes for co-management or assigning good neighbor authority, or this program is absolutely the most important thing we can do. And I'm hoping I can get my colleagues to also agree to field hearings. Now, in your testimony, you discussed the 2023 Indian Forest Asset Management Team report that included recommendations for improving management of Indian forests. How can the committee support the work to implement those recommendations?
Well, I think first, holding an oversight hearing would be very beneficial. While you've seen the report, I'm sure you see lots of reports on a daily basis. So having an opportunity to discuss those issues, what the recommendations of the report were, and how we can pass policy or legislative bills that would be beneficial in addressing some of those issues. That would include management perspectives, funding limitations or challenges, and a vast array of other things. Again, several hundred recommendations from the report. But I know that we requested the oversight hearing. We tried to schedule a field hearing because there's just not a replication that we can bring here that shows you what things look like on the ground. So to the extent the committee is willing, we'd love to have you somewhere out west, I think would be a good example, to show you some of the work that's happening on the ground, some of the impacts that are happening from wildfires, insect and disease, and some of the tools that tribes are using to help mitigate that.
Great. I absolutely agree. And again, I think the Pacific I know that the Pacific Northwest is leading the way, and being able to have our colleagues come out and see what's happening there, and again, figuring out solutions to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible in managing our forests would be beneficial for everyone. Thank you so much for your answering the questions.
The gentlelady yields back. Thank you very much. The chairman now recognizes the member from Washington, Ms. Randall, for 5 minutes of questions. Ms. Randall.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you again to all of you here before us sharing your experience with the subcommittee so that we can better support this incredible work that you're doing. President Capoeman, you mentioned a little bit of this in your testimony, but I'm wondering if you can expand some about the importance of asserting greater self-governance over the issues directly impacting areas like forestry. Why is it so important?
Well, first off, the most important part is that all of us tribes, have lived in these areas, since the beginning of time, and we know how to manage the resource, whether it be the water, fish, timber, land, air, all of these things. We know how to do this, and how that impacts our tribal members on the ground every day is what matters, not just for today, but for those yet unborn. That's the critical piece for all of us. And how we do that, that's been the mystery for us working with federal agencies, is how do we put that piece together to make that happen? For at least in Quinault's case, we've had a relationship with the federal government for 170 years, and it's weighted more towards a bad relationship more than it is a good relationship. We want to turn that around. The best way to turn that around is to allow us the inherent right to govern our resources in a way that we feel is best, because that's what works. That's what truly works. And you come down and you look at our reservation and you see how some of the things we've implemented there to protect habitat, to protect land. It truly is working for us, and that's the model. Those are some of the models we would like to see go forth. And we've recommended some of those things in this document here as a way to get this to the next stage. And so I hope the committee really considers keeping this on as a project that is not just a project, but something that is there and that tribes can use, and no longer a demonstration project, but something that's done. So that's what we'd like to see.
Thank you. And, as we have heard that you're still in the process of finalizing the Indian Trust Asset Management Plan under ITARA. Can you speak a little bit to the successes, but also the ongoing challenges you faced as you navigate this process?
Yeah, I think a lot of the challenges have been, like I said, the follow-through from the BIA on how we should do this. The communication piece. It seems to me like there's a force. The BIA's the force. It's been done a certain way for so many years. It's been done this way by the BIA that there's like an ownership. There's a fear of letting go and letting tribes do what we've done. And I think that's what's been holding this up, and how we get beyond that is we have more hearings like this. We have some action plans that come out of this that guide us to a more complete project.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Schultz-Oliver, in just a few seconds. Can you touch on how the trust asset management plans can be a strategic tool for climate resilience, which is such an important issue for, I know, those of us on the Olympic Peninsula?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think one of the key elements of the plans is that tribes can elevate their priorities, and many of our tribes, especially in the ATNI region, do have an eye towards protecting that's not protecting our climate, but have an eye to making sure that our resources are protected from the impacts of any climate actions.
The gentlelady yields back. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and also my colleagues, members, for their questions. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask that you please respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on Friday, February 28, 2025. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these questions. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.